The room smelled like cigarette smoke and old money. It was May of 1945, and the war in Europe had finally gone quiet. Not with a whisper, but with the collapse of the most violent regime the modern world had ever seen. The Nazi machine that had devoured nations, murdered millions, and dragged an entire civilization into darkness had surrendered. Its officers were being rounded up, its leaders were being hunted, and its most theatrical figure, a man who wore medals the way most men wore skin, was sitting in a chair somewhere in Bavaria, waiting. Hermann Göring had surrendered to the Americans, not with shame, not with his head bowed, but with his chin lifted and his chest full of the kind of arrogance that only comes from decades of being treated like royalty. He expected deference. He expected officers who understood rank, who understood power, who understood that even a defeated Reich Marshal deserved a certain level of professional courtesy. He had handed himself over believing that his fame, his infamy, would earn him something close to respect. What he did not expect was George Patton. The man who arrived was not diplomatic. He was not polished in the way that politicians are polished. He was iron and fury wrapped in 4 stars, a general who had driven his tanks across 3 continents and had zero patience for men who dressed up evil in tailored uniforms and expected applause. When Göring reached out his hand, expecting the ritual of military courtesy, something happened that stunned the room into absolute silence. Patton refused, not quietly, not diplomatically, in a way that made sure everyone present understood exactly what was happening and why. What followed was one of the most extraordinary confrontations of the post-war period, a collision between 2 colossal egos, 2 completely different visions of what power meant, and 2 men who had spent the entire war on opposite sides of history. To understand why Patton did what he did, you have to understand who these 2 men were, what they each believed, and what was really at stake in that meeting, because this wasn't just about manners. This was about what America stood for. This was about what victory actually meant. And this was about one general who refused to let a war criminal believe, even for one moment, that the world still owed him anything. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born in 1893 into the kind of family that liked to believe it mattered. His father had been a colonial administrator for the German Empire, and Göring grew up absorbing the idea that the world was divided into those who commanded and those who obeyed. He was a decorated fighter pilot in the First World War, a genuine ace with 22 aerial victories, a man who had earned real courage in the skies before he decided that courage was less important than cunning. After the war, he drifted into the orbit of a young Austrian agitator named Adolf Hitler, and everything changed. Göring became one of the founding pillars of the Nazi movement. He was Hitler's right hand, his enforcer, his showman. Where Hitler was intense and messianic, Göring was theatrical and extravagant. He wore uniforms designed to dazzle, loaded himself with jewels and medals, threw lavish parties at his enormous estate called Karen Hall, and cultivated an image as the Renaissance man of fascism, part warrior, part art collector, part emperor without an empire. He commanded the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and in the early years of the war, he delivered the victories that Hitler needed. France fell, Poland burned, the skies over Europe turned dark with German bombers. But Göring was also a fraud on a spectacular scale. When the Battle of Britain proved impossible to win, when the Luftwaffe failed to bomb England into submission, Göring began to slip. Hitler lost faith in him. The inner circle began to mock him behind closed doors. His drug addiction worsened. His weight ballooned. His judgment became erratic. And yet, he held on to his titles, his palaces, his art collection, much of it stolen from Jewish families across occupied Europe. And he held on to his belief that he was still, somehow, a figure of consequence. By April of 1945, with Soviet forces closing in on Berlin and Hitler dissolving into madness in his underground bunker, Göring made a desperate move. He sent a telegram to Hitler suggesting that since the Führer was besieged and possibly incapacitated, perhaps Göring should assume leadership of the Reich. Hitler, in a final explosion of paranoid fury, declared Göring a traitor, had him arrested by the SS, and stripped him of all his titles. Göring spent the final days of the Nazi regime under house arrest at his Bavarian estate, surrounded by his stolen paintings and his morphine supply, wondering what the future held. When the Americans arrived, Göring dressed carefully. He wore his medals. He expected to be received as a prisoner of consequence, perhaps even as a historical figure worthy of careful, respectful treatment. He reportedly told his captors that he wished to meet with General Eisenhower. He implied, with breathtaking audacity, that there might be negotiations to be had, that his knowledge, his connections, his very presence could be useful to the victors. He was a Reich Marshal, after all. He had been the second most powerful man in Germany. Surely that meant something. He was taken to the headquarters of the American 36th Infantry Division, and then arrangements were made for him to be brought before senior American officers. The encounter that followed has been described in various accounts, pieced together from witnesses and military records, and it reveals something essential, not just about Göring and Patton, but about the moral clarity that Patton carried into everything he did. George Smith Patton Jr. was born in 1885 in San Marino, California, into a family with deep military roots. His ancestors had fought in the American Revolution. His grandfather had died in the Civil War. War was not just a profession for Patton. It was an inheritance, a calling, almost a religion. He attended West Point, competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympics, served under Pershing in Mexico, and distinguished himself in World War I with the same combination of reckless courage and brilliant tactical thinking that would define his entire career. By the time World War II began, Patton was already a legend in American military circles, known for his temper, his profanity, his ivory-handled pistols, and his absolute conviction that the only purpose of war was to win it as fast and as violently as possible. He believed in aggression. He believed in speed. He believed in never letting the enemy rest, never letting him breathe, never giving him the psychological comfort of believing that the Americans might slow down or hesitate. His performance in North Africa was electrifying. His conquest of Sicily was stunning in its speed. His breakout across France after D-Day was possibly the greatest sustained armored offensive in American military history. The Third Army under Patton moved so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up, that other generals struggled to understand how he was doing it, that German commanders found themselves outflanked before they had finished reporting where he was. But Patton was also a man of ferocious moral conviction, even if that conviction sometimes expressed itself in unconventional ways. He despised cowardice. He despised dishonesty. He despised men who used power to torment the weak. And when he saw what had been done in the Nazi concentration camps, when American forces liberated Buchenwald and Ohrdruf, and the full horror of what the Nazis had done became undeniable, Patton was shaken in a way that very few things had ever shaken him. He had seen war. He had seen men killed in ways that would stop the heart. But the systematic, industrial, bureaucratic murder of millions of human beings, the starvation, the medical experiments, the gas chambers, the mass graves, hit him differently. He wrote in his diary about what he saw at Ohrdruf. He forced German civilians to tour the camp, to see with their own eyes what their country had done. He wept, reportedly, for the first and one of the very few times anyone had ever seen him do so. And he developed, in those final weeks of the war, an absolute, uncompromising contempt for the men who had created and sustained the Nazi system. Göring was not an abstraction to Patton. Göring was a name, a face, a biography. He was the man who had built the Gestapo. He was the man who had signed orders that set in motion the machinery of the Holocaust. He was the man who had looted the art of Europe while Jewish families were being loaded onto trains. He was the man who had commanded the bombing campaigns that killed civilians across the continent. And now, in May of 1945, he was sitting somewhere in Bavaria with his medals on, expecting to be treated like a gentleman. The encounter, by most accounts, did not begin as a formal interrogation. It was something more ambiguous, a meeting that Göring had essentially maneuvered himself into by leveraging his celebrity status as a prisoner. He had been photographed by American journalists already. He had been charming and voluble with his captors, speaking good English, making jokes, playing the role of the amiable rogue who had just happened to end up on the wrong side of history. Some American officers found him genuinely disarming. That was the danger with Göring. He was charismatic in the way that really dangerous people sometimes are. Patton, when he encountered Göring, was not disarmed. He was not charmed. He was not interested in the performance. The exact details of what happened depend on which account you consult, but the core of the story is consistent and has been corroborated by multiple witnesses. Göring, in his trademark fashion, extended his hand. The formal military greeting, the gesture of one senior officer acknowledging another. It was calculated. It was deliberate. It was Göring's way of saying, "We are both professionals. We are both men of rank. Let us observe the courtesies." Patton looked at the hand. He looked at Göring, and he refused to shake it. Not with embarrassment, not with a mumbled excuse. He refused it in the way that Patton refused everything he found contemptible, directly, publicly, and with the full force of his personality, making it absolutely clear why he was doing what he was doing. Some accounts suggest Patton said something in that moment. The exact words vary by source, but the sentiment does not. Göring was not a fellow officer. Göring was a war criminal. Göring was responsible for the deaths of civilians, the destruction of cities, the construction of the terror apparatus that had enslaved a continent. The handshake was not something Patton was willing to give, because to shake that hand would be to imply a kind of equivalence, the respectful acknowledgement of one warrior by another, that Patton flatly rejected. This was not a small gesture. In military culture, the handshake between opposing officers carries enormous symbolic weight. It is the acknowledgement that however brutal the conflict, both sides observed a certain code. Patton had shaken hands with enemy officers before. He understood the ritual and what it meant. His refusal here was not ignorance of the custom. It was the deliberate inversion of it. It was Patton saying, with his hands at his sides and his eyes locked on Göring, "You do not deserve this from me, and you will not get it." Göring, by all accounts, was stunned. This was not what he had expected. He had handled himself well with other American officers. He had been clever and entertaining, and had successfully projected the image of a man who could be reasoned with, even dealt with. He had expected that Patton, being a warrior himself, would recognize him as a fellow warrior and respond accordingly. He had completely misread the man across from him. What Göring didn't understand, what many people who encountered Patton failed to understand, was that Patton's love of war had nothing to do with admiration for men who used military power for murder. Patton was ferocious on the battlefield because he believed in fighting enemies who were fighting back in the open, under conditions where both sides accepted the deadly game they were playing. He had genuine contempt for what he called unnecessary brutality, the kind practiced not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, administrative machinery of extermination. The camps, to Patton, were not a byproduct of war. They were something categorically different, something evil in a way that went beyond the violence he himself had practiced and celebrated. He had liberated those camps, he had walked through them, he had smelled them, and now the man whose organization had created the Gestapo, whose signature was on documents that authorized mass murder, was standing in front of him with his hand out, expecting a greeting. No, absolutely not. The confrontation did not end there. Göring, rattled but resilient, he had survived the collapse of the Third Reich, after all, which requires a certain psychological toughness, attempted to recalibrate. He reportedly tried to engage Patton in conversation about military matters, the kind of professional soldier-to-soldier dialogue he had found useful with other American officers. He may have referenced his own wartime experience, his record as a fighter pilot, the shared language of men who had led armies. Patton was not interested, not in any of it. He made his assessment of Göring known, not in a long speech, but in the compressed, devastating way Patton always expressed his contempt, briefly, memorably, and with words that left no room for misunderstanding. He reportedly characterized Göring in terms that made clear he did not see him as a soldier, did not see him as an officer, and did not see him as anything other than a criminal who happened to have worn a uniform. This was a problem for Göring's entire self-conception. His entire strategy for survival in the post-war world depended on getting the Americans to see him as a useful, interesting, perhaps even likable figure, a complex man of his time, a pragmatist who had done what he had to do in a system that gave him no choice, perhaps someone who could be leveraged against the Soviets. He had watched the beginning of tensions between the Western Allies and Stalin. He understood, perhaps better than most, how quickly yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's partner when geopolitics demanded it. He was auditioning, in his own way, for a role in the emerging Cold War world. Patton demolished that audition before it began. There were other American officers who were more susceptible to Göring's performance. Some found him genuinely fascinating. One well-documented episode involved an American officer hosting Göring at a dinner that was later reported in the press and caused significant controversy back in the United States. The image of American officers breaking bread with a Nazi war criminal, while the world was still trying to process the full horror of what had been discovered in the camps, was jarring to the American public and to many in the military. It contributed to a broader debate about how the defeated Nazi leadership should be treated, as prisoners, as historical curiosities, or as something else entirely. Patton sat firmly on one side of that debate. He did not want a debate. He wanted a reckoning. This was, in fact, one of the dimensions of Patton's character that made him both invaluable and impossible to manage. He had no political filter. He had no diplomatic instinct in the traditional sense. He operated according to a personal code that was absolute, and that he applied without the softening influence of career calculation or institutional pressure. When he thought something was wrong, he said it. When he thought someone deserved contempt, he showed it. This had gotten him into serious trouble during the war, most famously with the slapping incidents in Sicily, when he struck 2 soldiers he accused of cowardice, which nearly ended his career and set off a firestorm that Eisenhower had to spend enormous political capital managing. But it was also what made him one of the most effective commanders of the 20th century. His soldiers knew exactly where they stood with him. His enemies knew exactly what he was bringing, and the men he encountered in the wreckage of the Nazi regime knew, when they met him, that they were not dealing with someone who could be manipulated or charmed or played. Göring would go on to face the Nuremberg tribunal, where he would find a much larger audience for his performance. And it has to be said, in the full complexity of history, that Göring at Nuremberg was impressive in a deeply uncomfortable way. He was intelligent, combative, quick, and genuinely effective in cross-examination in a way that frustrated the prosecutors and dismayed many observers. He made his case not just for himself, but for the Nazi leadership, challenging the legal framework of the trial, questioning the concept of retroactive criminality, and defending decisions with a sharpness that forced his interrogators to work hard. He was not a broken man. He was not repentant. He was, to the end, himself. He was ultimately convicted on all 4 counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy, and sentenced to death. The night before he was scheduled to be hanged, he swallowed a cyanide capsule that had somehow been smuggled into his cell, cheating the executioner in a final act of theatrical defiance that seemed, grimly, entirely in character. But all of that came later. In May of 1945, in that room in Bavaria, what mattered was the moment itself, the extended hand, the refusal, the silence that followed. To understand why that moment mattered beyond its immediate drama, you have to think about what it represented symbolically. The end of a war is not just a military event. It is a statement about values. It is a declaration about what the victorious side believes was worth fighting for. And the way victors treat the defeated, the rituals and courtesies and negotiations that follow the fighting, is one of the ways that statement gets made concrete. There were voices in the immediate post-war period who argued for treating the Nazi leadership with a certain level of formal respect, not because of sympathy for what they had done, but for pragmatic reasons. The argument went something like this: the trials need to be seen as legitimate proceedings, not victor's justice, and maintaining certain formal courtesies helps establish that legitimacy. Additionally, there were intelligence concerns. Many of these men knew things about Soviet capabilities, German military technology, European underground networks that could be valuable in the emerging confrontation with Moscow. There were reasons, practical and political, to keep them engaged, communicative, even relatively comfortable. Patton was aware of these arguments. He rejected them, not because he was naive about geopolitics, Patton was deeply interested in strategy and had his own strong views about the coming confrontation with the Soviets, views that would eventually get him removed from command. But because he believed that certain moral lines could not be crossed for the sake of convenience without doing damage that exceeded any practical benefit. To shake Göring's hand was, for Patton, to make a statement that the two of them occupied the same moral universe, that their differences were merely those of opposing commanders in a professional conflict, reducible to strategy and circumstance, rather than the fundamental difference between a man who fought wars and a man who oversaw atrocity. Patton was not willing to make that statement, not for intelligence purposes, not for diplomatic smoothness, not for anything. This was also connected to Patton's experience with the concentration camps in a way that cannot be separated from the Göring encounter. Ohrdruf had been one of the first camps liberated by American forces, and Patton had been among the first senior American commanders to enter one. He had gone through it with Eisenhower and Bradley on April 12, 1945. What they saw there, the emaciated bodies, the evidence of systematic murder, the infrastructure of industrial killing, affected all three men profoundly, but it affected Patton in a particular way. Eisenhower responded by immediately ordering documentation, photographs, testimony, reports, because he was already thinking about the future, about the need for irrefutable evidence against Holocaust denial. Bradley responded with a kind of quiet horror that seemed to deepen his existing determination to see the war through. Patton responded with something more visceral. He reportedly vomited outside the camp. He reportedly wept. And then he hardened, not in the direction of withdrawal or disengagement, but in the direction of absolute moral certainty about what had been done and who had done it. Göring had not personally operated a concentration camp. He had not personally turned a gas valve or loaded a body onto a cart, but he had been one of the architects of the system that created those camps. He had been one of the men who sat in comfortable offices and signed documents and gave speeches and created the ideological and administrative framework within which millions of people were murdered. The distance between Göring's medals and the bodies at Ohrdruf was a distance of paperwork and delegation, not of moral responsibility. Patton understood this. He understood it in his bones, in the way that men who have actually seen the results of decisions sometimes understand them, not as an abstract argument about guilt and causation, but as a concrete, visceral, undeniable reality. He had walked through the camp. He had seen what the Nazi system produced. And when Göring put out his hand, Patton was not seeing a defeated general. He was seeing one of the men responsible for Ohrdruf. The refusal was not impulsive. It was, in its way, one of the most considered things Patton ever did. He had made the calculation, the moral arithmetic, and he had arrived at his answer before he walked into the room. There is a broader historical irony here that deserves attention. Patton, in the months following the German surrender, would find himself in deep political trouble not because of his treatment of Göring, but because of his statements about the denazification process that was supposed to root out Nazi influence from German society and government. Patton, in a series of press conferences and private statements, expressed skepticism about denazification, not because he was sympathetic to Nazism, but because he had become convinced that the real threat facing Europe was Soviet communism, and that the denazification process was removing experienced administrators and officials at exactly the moment when Germany needed functional government to resist Soviet pressure. These statements caused an enormous scandal. Patton made comparisons that were widely reported as suggesting equivalence between Nazis and ordinary political parties, which was a catastrophic misreading of his position, but also a reflection of his chronic inability to choose his words carefully when he believed he was right. Eisenhower eventually relieved him of command of the Third Army in October 1945, reassigning him to a lesser role that Patton found humiliating. He died in December of that year from injuries sustained in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany, never having returned to the United States after the war, never having received the victory parade or the public celebration that might have been his. It is one of history's sharper ironies that the man who refused to shake Göring's hand, who maintained with absolute clarity his contempt for the Nazi leadership, who wept at Ohrdruf and forced German civilians to confront what their country had done, was also the man who got into serious political trouble for comments that were taken as suggesting Nazi equivalents. History is rarely tidy. Great men are rarely simple, and Patton was neither tidy nor simple. But the moment with Göring, that specific moment, the hand extended and the hand refused, was simple. It was one of the clearest moral statements of the entire post-war period, made not in a speech or a document or a court filing, but in a gesture, or rather in the deliberate absence of a gesture. And it came from a man who had driven tanks across 3 continents, and had spent years in the business of controlled violence, and who had no illusions about what war was or what it cost. Göring had assumed that military men recognized a brotherhood that transcended politics, that the shared experience of command created a bond between professionals that the moral catastrophes of history couldn't entirely sever. It was an assumption that had served him reasonably well with some of his American captors. It failed completely with Patton, because Patton's identity as a warrior was inseparable from his identity as an American, which meant it was inseparable from his identity as a man who believed in something beyond power for its own sake. Patton believed in victory, yes. He believed in aggression and speed and the violent imposition of will on a battlefield, but he believed in these things in service of something, not just abstract victory, but the specific defeat of specific evil. The war, for Patton, had never been purely professional. It had been moral. It had been necessary, and the necessity had been demonstrated most horrifically in the camps. So when Göring put out his hand, he was asking Patton to set aside the moral dimension and engage only with the professional one, to see them both as men who had played the game of war on different sides, under different flags, but essentially equivalent in the fundamentals of what they were. Patton's refusal was his answer. No, we are not equivalent. We have never been equivalent, and I will not pretend otherwise for the sake of courtesy. This exchange, this confrontation, this moment in a room in Bavaria in the spring of 1945 has become one of those historical episodes that gets referenced repeatedly precisely because it crystallizes something that is usually diffuse and complicated. It makes visible a moral choice that was being made in countless ways by countless people in the aftermath of the war. How to treat the defeated, what courtesies to extend, what lines to maintain, what the victory actually meant. Many of the answers given to those questions in the immediate post-war period were ambiguous, expedient, pragmatic. Intelligence agencies were hiring former Nazis. Scientists who had worked for the Third Reich were being recruited for American and Soviet space and weapons programs. The full accounting of what had been done was still being assembled, and the full weight of it had not yet settled into the historical consciousness of the world. Patton's answer was not ambiguous. It was not expedient. It was not pragmatic. It was the answer of a man who had seen what he had seen and was not going to pretend otherwise. Whether Patton was, on balance, a great man or merely a great general, whether his later political stumbles reveal something fundamental about his limitations or are best understood as the miscalculations of a warrior adrift in politics. These are questions that historians continue to argue about, and there is merit on multiple sides of those arguments. He was extraordinary. He was also deeply flawed. He was capable of tremendous empathy and tremendous cruelty. He was one of the most effective military commanders of the 20th century and one of the most politically volatile senior officers the American military has ever produced. But the moment with Göring stands apart from all of that complexity because it was so uncomplicated. He was asked to perform a ritual of respect. He refused. And his reason for refusing was not calculation, not politics, not the management of his public image. It was the same direct, unfiltered moral certainty that had characterized everything he did, the same quality that made him impossible to manage and irreplaceable in the field. Göring, for his part, would have more time to perform. At Nuremberg, before the international press, before the world. He was good at performing. He was, in many ways, a brilliant man, twisted to terrible purpose. But in that moment in Bavaria, for perhaps one of the few times in his life, his performance failed him. Not because he wasn't trying, not because he chose the wrong words or the wrong posture, but because the man standing across from him had already decided, before he walked into the room, that no performance would be sufficient. There's something in that, something worth holding on to, In an age when clarity of moral judgment is sometimes dismissed as simplistic, and the ability to find nuance in the actions of terrible people is sometimes mistaken for sophistication, Patton was not a sophisticated man in that sense. He did not find Göring interesting. He did not find him complex. He found him responsible for Ohrdruf, and he responded accordingly. The hand remained unshaken. The point was made. And in the chaos and ambiguity of the post-war world, that moment, that simple, direct, unambiguous moment, remains one of the most precise moral statements the war produced. It is worth noting, finally, that Patton's refusal was not without risk. He was, at the time of this encounter, operating in a politically complex environment where the treatment of prisoners and defeated enemies was being watched carefully by journalists, politicians, and military superiors. The other direction, the one that produced the controversial dinners with Nazi officers, was the direction of accommodation, of keeping the lines of communication open, of treating even war criminals with a certain formal courtesy that made practical sense. Patton chose the other way, knowing that it was the more difficult choice professionally and not caring. This was the consistent thread of his life and career. Not a lack of intelligence or awareness. Patton was neither stupid nor unaware, but a deliberate prioritization of what he considered moral truth over what he considered political calculation. It cost him, over and over again. It cost him in Sicily. It would cost him again in his denazification comments. It contributed to his marginalization in the final months of his life, when the war he had been built for was over and the world he found himself in had no clear battlefield for him to dominate. He died in December 1945, 6 months after the encounter with Göring, in a car accident on a road near Mannheim. He had been in Germany less than a year as an occupation commander, restless and frustrated and out of his element in peacetime administration. He never saw Nuremberg. He never saw Göring's conviction or his final act of suicide the night before the execution. He never came home. But he left behind, among the many things he left behind, that moment in Bavaria. The hand extended, the hand refused, the silence in the room, and the absolute certainty of a man who had seen the camps and had made his judgment and was not going to revise it for anybody. Göring expected respect. Patton refused. And history, in the long run, has sided with Patton.